Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Contrary to Popular Wrestling. My name is James Southard. I am one of the hosts of this here podcast, and joining me by way of South Padre Island, Texas, by way of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, by way of Union, New Jersey, now residing in Oklahoma City, the one, the only, Carmine Despirito. How are you doing, Carmine?
Papa was a rolling stone, James. Papa was a rolling stone. I did get around quite a bit in the past 30 years.
For sure, and we'll probably talk about stories from all of those places because you've been involved in wrestling just about every single one of them, so sure we'll get around to that in various episodes of this podcast. But go ahead and tell the folks a little bit about your background in professional wrestling.
Well, I started off as a wrestling fan, just like, I would think just about everybody else that's in wrestling. There are probably a few exceptions. Ken Pantera said he wasn't a fan of wrestling.
Most of the divas back in the early 2000s were all lingerie models, so, hey.
There you go. And I took up photography. Senior year of high school, really wanted to be a photographer and took photos at all the matches. My dad used to take me to the Philadelphia Spectrum. My first show was 1980, Asbury Park Convention Hall. Bob Backlund defending the WWF title against Afa, the Wild Samoan. So I go back that far. And, like I said, I enjoyed taking photos. And around my senior year of high school, I submitted some photos to Wrestling Eye magazine. That just happened to be my favorite magazine. Used to give a lot of insider news in there, in the Phantom of the Ring column. And I thought, oh, you know what? This might be fun. I'll send in some photos, see what happens. And sure enough, a photo that I took of Roddy Piper was published as a pinup. Shortly thereafter, and I'm talking just like a few months later, Mike Ballou, the editor at the time of the magazine, passed away in a car accident. And I was just a senior in high school, and I grabbed the job. I couldn't believe it, but I landed the job as senior in high school as the editor of a national newsstand wrestling publication. And that's where it started for me. From there, I started to manage because I just couldn't stand just taking photos at the ring, especially when I got to meet a lot of the indie guys. One of those indie guys was Ted Petty, known then as the Cheetah Kid, known later as Rocco Rock from Public Enemy, a very dear friend of mine. And he's the one that really got my foot in the door for me in wrestling. And from there, I managed, there are many different names. UB Marks was my original one. Do you get it? UB Marks. And then I went on. Later on, Diamond Dallas Page came up with the name The Creator for me. And he gave me the title, but not necessarily a gimmick. And then I came up with a completely different gimmick that was kind of based on Jim Morrison. And then it kind of got dark, and I started wearing makeup. And I thought, I want to be if The Undertaker had a scary manager, I would be it. Anyway. And then I, separate from the managing, I also, of course, worked as the hustler, and that's the latest incarnation of yours truly. I promoted in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I moved there in 1993 and promoted there for 14 years, and that's really my claim to fame, I like to think. Some of the biggest stars in wrestling started with me in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Seth Rollins, Ken Anderson, Punk, CM Punk, Colt Cabana, Adam Pearce. Who else? Brad Bradley, Skull Crusher, Hornswoggle, Silas Young, the Bruce City Bruiser, who used to be known as Dinty Moore. He was named after a can of soup, if you didn't know that, folks. That's right. The Bruce City Bruiser, Ring of Honor star, was actually named after a can of soup. And I did that for 14 years. And I've been involved now lately with David Marquez, Championship Wrestling from Hollywood, and some other future projects that are coming up. And I just thought, what a keen idea to do a podcast. Because, hey, let's face it, everybody else has one. Right, James?
I'd say we might as well get on the bandwagon. Everybody and their mother's got a podcast, so do we.
Why not, right? So that's the idea here, folks. It's going to be a different type of podcast. It's going to be a conversational podcast, very topical. We're not going to be speaking about current news. Pretty much, we're going to pine for the old days in a lot of different ways. Hopefully, you'll learn something every week here on Contrary to Popular Wrestling. We've got a lot of great ideas and a lot of different guests that we're considering, and I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a blast. And I couldn't be happier than to have the great prodigy himself, James Southard, as my co-host.
See, how long have you known me? I got to correct you. It's James Southard. But to fill folks in kind of on my background, had to bust your balls there a little bit. Of course, my background isn't quite as long and illustrious as yours. I've only been really around wrestling for about 4 years now. My first show, I guess this is what made me love old school wrestling. I went to a show promoted by Jerry Bostic here in Oklahoma City area with some names like the Rock and Roll Express were on the card, as well as Hacksaw Jim Duggan. One of the matches that absolutely stole the show was Jerry Lawler versus Jeff Jarrett. And that was lucky enough to be my first introduction to independent wrestling. I'd been a fan for years beforehand, just watching on TV. And I guess I did the modern day version of being a photographer. I got into podcasts, which here I am once again. I got into a podcast with a guy named John Kirk back in the day, and that kind of got me started, introduced me to the guys at IWR and Jerry Bostic, and made my way, hanging around, putting up rings. Nowadays, I'm a ring announcer here in Oklahoma City and surrounding areas. More importantly now, I'm going to be the co-host of Contrary to Popular Wrestling here. So, as he said, we want to have a different show, if you will. We want to talk about the good old days and talk with some guests that you don't always hear on just every podcast, and share their stories and talk about things you wouldn't hear on an average news wrestling podcast, because you can get your news from hundreds of different sites and podcasts, but there is only one, Contrary to Popular Wrestling. And that's what we hope to bring you, is a interesting, fascinating, historical look at the way wrestling used to be.
Professional wrestling.
Real professional wrestling, exactly. Not sports entertainment.
Pro wrestling. Nobody uses the term pro wrestling anymore, do they? Who uses the term pro wrestling anymore other than the Japanese?
About to say, you don't hear it too much, or if they do, they refer to it as wrestling, that old-fashioned wrestling that nobody watches anymore. It's all sports entertainment.
What a great segue, really, because that's really what our first show is going to be about. It's going to be about wrestling culture, how it's changed through the years from a fan's perspective primarily, which I think everybody's going to find really, really interesting. We've got some great guests lined up. Evan Ginsburg, who was associate producer on The Wrestler. Wrestling Then and Now was a mainstay newsletter, one of the first newsletters in New York City. He has been a wrestling fan since the 70s. Also, Nikita Brezhnikov, I believe that's how you pronounce his last name.
I believe so.
Anyway, and he was, he adopted the name in tribute to the great Nikolai Volkov, by the way. And he got the chance to work with Nikolai as Nikolai's manager. He also wrote a phenomenal book about wrestling in New York City, very well spoken. He'll be another guest. Another that we're looking forward to have on is Howard Baum. You know Howard Baum, don't you, James?
The great Howard Baum, famous Miami, South Florida in general, photographer back in the 80s during the closing days of championship wrestling from Florida. You saw his photos in all the magazines. I think he'll be a really great guest to talk about the fantastic wrestling that was going on during that time period in Florida.
And of course, from LA, we have Vandal Drummond.
Everybody's favorite, Vandal Drummond. I got to put him over and say undefeated in AAA. He won't brag about it. He's too humble. But him and Louis Spicolli are undefeated in AAA.
And finally, another guest we're going to have is Scott Romer. Scott Romer, wrestling photographer, wrestling manager, has been around the business for 40 odd years. He just came out with a book that's really, really entertaining, and I think he's going to add a great perspective to all of this. So there you go. That's what we're going to start off with. Title of the show is Wrestling Culture.
And it'll be interesting to see how things have changed because, we'll have to total up how many years of fandom are in that group, but it'll be interesting to see how, because as I said, I only experienced things, as a younger fan since, a decade or so ago. So getting to compare, even just from different territories in the 70s and 80s to now, it'll be a very interesting conversation, I'm sure, and I'm sure the people listening will be very entertained and hopefully learn something.
Well, James, what you don't understand, you young whippersnapper, that when I was a fan growing up in New Jersey, the only access we had to wrestling was, of course, the shows on TV, which we had a variety of, even before cable, and the wrestling magazines that were 2 months out of date, wrestling news-wise. We didn't have access to news, to what was going on in the business, where today everybody has it. Right there in front of them. Couldn't be closer. It's right there on their phone. So things have changed. The experience of being a fan has changed. And these are things that we're going to explore and pontificate about, if you will, on our first episode of Contrary to Popular Wrestling. I hope everybody joins in. It's going to be a blast. And please share this video and let's spread the word. Look forward to hearing your guys' opinions about everything. And anything you'd like to add, James?
There will be plenty of pontificating on that topic, and we encourage you to join us in that conversation. We have an email set up if you wish to write to us on any topic. As said, we're mentioning on our first episode, we'll be talking wrestling culture, specifically of the fans, but also of wrestlers as well. If you want to add on to that conversation, feel free to drop us a line at our email, contrarypod@gmail.com. Contrarypod, contrarypod@gmail.com. Drop us a line, tell us about your experiences, and we might just read it right here on the Contrary to Popular Wrestling podcast. Also, be sure and follow us on Facebook, Contrary to Popular Wrestling with Carmine, Despirito, and James Southard. You can follow us there, find the latest updates, and we will be back with episode 1 very, very soon.